As usual, I hope this to be as much discussion as it is listening to me talk. We do have a mic set up. It is not on. We're having trouble having both of them on at the same time. So there's a button on the bottom that'll turn it on. So hope. Now, hope amid the temptation to despair. I decided to lead a session on hope because I was personally having a hard time holding on to it lately. And I figured if that's my experience, it's probably a common experience. So I thought we should talk about it. Some of you might be familiar with this quote from Frederick Buechner. The grace of God means something like, here's the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid. I keep this hanging in my, there's a print of it in my office here at church, actually. And to me, it really captures the sort of neverthelessness that you've heard me preach about now and again, that the world can be terrible and painful, and it is always also full of God and beautiful, and so there's reason to hope in our mixed experience of beauty and terror. Let's start with naming the challenges to hope. What are some of the things that are challenging your hopefulness right now? What's keeping you up at night? What are the things that you're trying not to think about? Where is your anxiety louder than your faith? Anybody? What are some of those things? Anticipating the election. Yeah. 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 Anxious. What else? Jim? Yeah. International news is so many places, right? We're looking at Palestine, we're looking at Ukraine, we're looking at Sudan and the Congo. Yeah. Yeah. Africa. Yeah. What else? What are some more of these challenges, Francis?
The divisions on the campuses over.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is then becoming religion as well as the politics.
Right. Yeah. The political positions and the religious traditions are getting muddied in a way that feels unhelpful and yeah, really challenging to people who are trying to maintain hope and be hope for the world. Yeah. Yes.
I'm worrying about one thing.
Yeah. Yeah. How do we figure out how to parent in the world that looks the way it does right now? Yeah. Challenges to reproductive rights is another thing that gives me anxiety. Yeah, Francis.
Kids who are getting too many mixed messages from their technology and not enough socialization with their own peers.
Yeah.
In real time.
Yeah. 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 We're increasingly attached more to our phones than we are connected to other people. And that's really bad, especially for youth, right? Before you've had a chance to sort of figure those things out. Anything else we want to add to this list before we start talking about hope? Yeah, right. The looming and already here climate crisis. Yeah. Right. Margaret.
Climate change is driving all this migration to Europe and to the US, and farmers can't live off their land anymore. It's a big issue in Europe and here, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, it's feeding into the election already, chaos on the border and scary.
And there's a sense of a domino effect, right? One shift shifts to something else, which shifts something else. And it's really easy for, at least for me, right? It's really easy for our anxiety to get louder than our faith. And so when that happens, it's time to sort of recenter and find that hope again. So what practices recenter you in hope? Or what's giving you hope right now? Or what beliefs do you hold that instill a sense of hopefulness in the way you see the world? What are some of these things for you all? Sharon. Yeah. Yeah, the passage from Paul that says, "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then we shall see face to face." Right? This sort of sense that we can't see the whole picture right now can actually be a hopeful thing, right? Because, instead of a hopeless feeling. Yeah, absolutely. What else? Francis. Walking outdoors. Yeah.
Yes, there is.
I have that relationship to cardinals in particular too. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, and there's something just about the beauty and the majesty of being in God's creation that is recentering for me, and I think for many of us. Bill, I think you had one. Tommy, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's what happened there.
I, I'll take maybe a little different approach to this. The first thing I'd say is that rooms like this is good,
Mhm.
right? So if you get people from all walks of life and they actually take time to sit to talk about it, that's pretty helpful.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And the fact that we don't have to worry that in general anything bad can happen to us for doing this, because that's not for everyone.
Right.
And then the other thing I'll say is, what else gives me hope is that if we have short-term memory,
Mm.
and mankind has gone through really tough,
Yeah.
and things have been way worse. I'm not saying that's great right now, but humans have seemed to get through.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we'll do it again and again and again, long things. So
That's a very hopeful outlook. I'm going to rephrase, or not rephrase, just sort of try to repeat for those folks who are online what you said, holding up the fact that these spaces exist where we can have these conversations and this connection and be fed in community, right? And by the fact that we are not alone, that there are places that don't have the sort of freedom to be together in this way and have these conversations. And then the other thing I heard you say was sort of zooming out to take a wider view of history and resting in the reassurance that that human history has known so many times of hopelessness and despair, and we continue to figure it out, right? And I think that that's a really, I don't know whether you intended it this way, but I think that along with that picture you're painting is the sense of, that God is bigger than us and bigger than human history and still working in it. And so there's a sense that we can rest in that reassurance that, we aren't seeing challenging times for the first time. That God is faithful. Absolutely. Margaret.
Practices going to Annapolis with Advocacy Day and again for the Poor People's Campaign, and a really good turnout for both of those events, including the Poor People's Campaign. Remember how it was so rainy? But anyway, it's good that we can speak up. I say our church community here gives me hope.
Yeah.
We're doing every week at Nourishing the Best that was feeding people.
Yeah.
Regardless of the outside politics, we can do some good.
I'm hearing you say that there's this the sense or the doing what we can for others is a hopeful thing and a thing that refills your well, your cup in terms of hope. Yeah, and all of the things that we do at St. John's in order to try to sort of pay a sense of hopefulness forward to the world, and to be God's hands and feet. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Anything else we want to add here? What practices? Yeah, please.
Sort of in line with what I would say, but giving a different point of view, I find sometimes that we know too much about the world now.
Mm.
And actually, and this is going to sound like sticking it in the sand, Sophia, but narrowing the scope of what I'm concerned with
Yes.
to things where I can realistically imagine myself making a difference. And that might be nothing but stopping on the street and hoping somebody who's even worse shape than I am cross the street.
Mm-hmm.
Or, as you know, as Margaret's suggested, working with some local efforts and trying to shut out the rest of it.
Yeah, I hear you talking about discerning what is ours to do and not, and therefore resisting the urge to become overwhelmed with the fact that there is so much. There was a quote from one of the reasons is they seem to be interfering with each other when they're both on at the same time. We could, okay, so that would be wonderful. Thank you, Sari. We made an effort, but it didn't pan out. Nadia Bolz-Weppers, who's a Lutheran pastor, said on, and I was struck by this, the quote's 2 or 3 years old now, but to your point, that we are not wired to absorb all of the world's pain in the ways that we can access it now through social media and through our phones, So we are absorbing a lot more pain and grief and suffering and despair than previous generations, right? We have that access now, and we're not really wired to be able to bear all of that. And so I do think it's very good advice to ask, what is ours to do? Where are the places that I can make a difference? And to be assured that a small difference is a difference that matters, right? And that when we do what we can do, where we can do it, that has a ripple effect. So for me, one of the things that, oh, please, Barbara, go ahead. Yes, one of them was about, yes, we can hear you. And one of them was about, why aren't we using the mic? Thank you. So I'm glad that you can hear me and people who are online, and we're working on making it so that you can hear all of us. Thank you for your patience. Thank you, Sari. We didn't manage to figure that out. And so if you're online and you'd like to chime in, the raise hand function is the easiest way for me to see that you're asking a question. And if you are in the room, if you could use the mic, that will allow people online to hear us all. Thank you, Sari. One of the wells that I go to is, certain theologians and spiritual thinkers that speak to me. And so about a month ago, I picked up this book that's been on my shelf for about 3 or 4 years now, called The Spirit of Hope, Theology for a World in Peril. And this is by a theologian named Jürgen Moltmann, who is known as a theologian of hope. His theology is he burst onto the scene in 1967 with a book called The Theology of Hope. And so he's talked a lot about it. This is a pretty recent book. It's about 5 years old. So it's really trying to speak specifically to us in the 21st century. This is actually a quote, not from this book, but from an earlier work. He says, "Totally without hope, one cannot live. To cease to hope is to cease to live. Hell is hopelessness." And he goes on to say that there's a reason why in Dante's Inferno, the inscription on the gates of hell is, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." David, you had your hand up.
how are you using
Hope and faith. I do think that they are related, but distinct. Yes, yes. Let's talk a little bit more about it. Do you have a follow-up question about hope and faith? Okay. I want to talk to you a little bit about. Well, first, are there any more questions? Are there questions or comments at this juncture before we keep going? Okay. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Jürgen Moltmann because his background is precisely from where his theology of hope comes. He was born in Hamburg, Germany in 1926 to a family that he describes as thoroughly secular. He is still with us at 98. He was drafted into military service at 16 years old and became a soldier in the German army. He had this experience of working in an aircraft battery when in his hometown when it was bombed by the Royal Air Force. The attack killed 40,000 people, including a friend of his whom he was standing beside. And he says that is the first time he ever cried out to God, saying, "God, where are you?" And this is sort of an interesting aside. He has made the distinction that the question, "Where are you?" is very different than the question, "Why did you allow this to happen?" Which is a question that we talk about as the theodicy question when we ask, well, if God is both good and powerful, why do bad things happen to good people? Why is there evil in the world? And it's a question that we talk about in church circles and in theology circles, right? It's a question that nags a lot of us in our attempts to understand who God is and what God is about. Moltmann, in particular, said he's uninterested in this question because it is speculative. It doesn't reflect the personal and biblical God that he has come to know, and it sort of ignores these other attributes of God that he thinks are more important: the personalness of God, God's love, God's compassion, God's mercy, and sort of keeps the conversation about these sort of untouchable attributes of goodness and of power. And for Moltmann, God is with us in the world in loving relationship, and that is what is so powerful. In 1945, when he was ordered to the front lines, he surrendered to the next British soldier he encountered, and he spent the next 3 years as a prisoner of war. And while he was imprisoned, news of Auschwitz and Buchenwald started to reach the camp, and he began to lose all faith in the German secular culture in which he was raised. It was also there at camp that he met a group of Christians and was given a copy of the New Testament and the Psalms by an American chaplain, and gradually sort of shifted from this secular upbringing of his youth to the Christian faith. Just became more and more identified with Christianity. And he says, "I didn't find Christ, he found me." And that reminds me of the words that we heard in last week's gospel and that we've been hearing in the Eucharistic prayer for this Easter season at both 9 and at 5. "You did not choose me, yet I chose you." And Moltmann's experience was certainly of being found when he was the most lost. After the war, he became a pastor in the Reformed tradition, prolific theologian, publishing 9 major works and about 39 other books in theology. And he says that his experience as a prisoner of war gave him a great and a lived understanding of how suffering and hope reinforce each other. So for him, suffering actually doesn't undermine hope. It gives it its shape. He says that Christian hope is not about the power of positive thinking. It's not about denial of the suffering and injustice in the world, of the evil in the world, or about bypassing those sorts of things in favor of just an optimism for its own sake, but rather that Christian hope must acknowledge the suffering of the world in order to bear witness to the reason why we have our hope in the Christian faith, right? Which is God's promise to be present in the world, to heal it and to redeem it. I'm going to pause here so we can ask questions or add or nuance anything. I see a lot of thinking faces. So talk to me about what's going on. Yeah, Cindy. It's okay.
I have a problem or a question about that last bit. It almost feels to me like it's promoting suffering as a means of getting to hope. More than just acknowledging, maybe that's all it is, acknowledging that yes, there is suffering,
Right.
but we don't need suffering to have hope. Or
I
do
don't
we?
think he would say that we need suffering to have hope, but that hope that does not acknowledge suffering is not based in, probably not based in something that is strong enough to withstand the realities of the world, right? That a hope that ignores suffering can't really speak to the realities of suffering. And we live in a world that does suffer. And so hope on a Christian basis needs to be able to acknowledge the suffering and the injustice in the world in order to have any kind of chance at redeeming it or at healing it, right? If we just ignore it and say, well, we have hope because God is good, and ignore all of these, all of the real suffering and injustice in the world, then we're not actually living into God's promise for us to do more than proclaim God. But the God's it's the promise and also the responsibility, right? That we can rely on God's presence with us, and also that God's presence with us conveys on us the responsibility to be God's hands and feet for other people. And so for him, they had to go together. Does that help some? Anybody else? Questions? Thoughts? David, here, let me hand you the mic.
I'm just curious about his redemption process, because I can't imagine today us accepting an ex-Nazi and as a reformer.
Yeah.
Today's culture would not, I don't think, would allow that. And I'm just wondering, what was his redemption like?
Well, and isn't that sad? But I think that if we take God seriously, if we take Peter's story seriously that Sarah just preached on, then there has to be room for the redemption of everyone, of all things, right? Then we have to, if we take God seriously, then we should expect people to grow and evolve, and not punish them for where they've been, but celebrate where they have arrived. I think that's part of what the resurrection story means, right? Yes, Tommy. Oh, Mike, yes. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
So the sense that I'm going to try to make of this is that he should actually be praised more than everybody else at that time.
I didn't say that.
No. I'm saying that.
Okay.
I'm saying that because he was actually faced with the fact that he was a Nazi and he chose to leave versus everybody else. They were never put in that position in the first place. And so I think it's very easy for us to all say, oh, Nazi, I wouldn't have been that way.
Right.
Right. I would definitely not have gone that route. But we can say that because we were never actually forced into that situation.
Right.
So the fact that he actually was found in that place in his life where he was a Nazi and still chose to leave is pretty admirable.
Right. And I mean, at his own peril, right? He became
Correct.
a POW for 2 or 3 years and, was confined in a camp because he couldn't in good conscience continue for the German army. Barbara.
We were talking yesterday about stereotypes and how we have to get past them. And I think that it's not in our culture right now to do that, but it is something we need to work toward, to think about the whole person and not be quick to judge.
Right. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think that if we take our faith seriously, that's exactly what we're called to do, right? Is to regard people as whole people already beloved to God, and to relate on that basis rather than the basis of, well, I think you're wrong about that, or you're falling short over here, right? If we are all at one time, if we all at one time or another fall short of who we were meant to be, which I think is true, then just as equal is the grace that covers everybody.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, like, if you don't believe that someone who is like a Nazi type can't be redeemed, you should read none of Paul's letters.
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So some people are happy not to read Paul's letters.
Sometimes I'm very happy not to read Paul's letter. Any other comments or questions or, nuances we want to add here before we move on? Anybody online? Okay. So for Moltmann, Christian hope is grounded in the crucifixion and the resurrection of Christ as God's promise to us that our present circumstances will not be our ultimate circumstances, right? That suffering and death do not have the last word. Christian hope then for Moltmann is the active and faithful expectation that God, with our help, and that's a really important qualifier, with our help, will heal and transform the world. This doesn't mean the denial of suffering, doesn't mean ignoring an unjust and death-driven world as it is. It doesn't mean that we can transform the world ourselves apart from God's help and apart from God's empowerment, but rather it's based in this relationship, right? God's promise to us, God's covenant with us, essentially, originally, at bottom, is this relationship. We are in covenant with a God who promises, that death is not the last word, and calls us not only to bear witness to what that means in the world, but to enact what that means in the world, right? So it calls us to our own actions of healing, of justice seeking, of alleviating suffering wherever we can, with the understanding that we cannot alleviate it all, but to doing what we can where we can, actively loving our neighbors in God's name. So for Moltmann, when we're tempted to lose hope, we're called by our faith to remember that promise, those promises that God has made to us in the person of Christ, in the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. And to, as Margaret was saying, to answer that promise with our own actions, right? With our own sort of mimicry of God's love toward us. Anything you want to add or ask while we're on this slide? Yes?
So I was going to suggest something that surely would have had me burned at the stake in the Counter-Reformation, and might still be considered heresy by almost everybody. But we are made in the image of God. And I take that not to mean the physical image, but I take it to mean our feelings, our imagination, everything else. And we combine what we might think of as good spiritual action and not so good. I mean, that's the way humans are. And so to his question of where is God in all of this, one kind of answer is, well, it is inside of me, and it is also inside of every individual person, and it is up to us to find our good reaction to something instead of our bad reaction to something. And that is also intimately tied up with being able to see that other person around or whatever also has that same duality and also has the same ability to be just as kind as I would like myself to be. And Anyway, that's one way to say one way to answer where is God in all of this.
Carl, I think that's really beautiful and well put. I agree with you very much that, and when we talk about being made in the image of God, we are, right? We are talking about myself individually and yourself individually. But the other dimension of that, that has always been really powerful to me is that when we talk about God as Trinity, we are talking about God as loving and mutual relationship. And so there is a sense in which we can understand ourselves as made in the image of God as loving and mutual relationship, which means it is me and you individually, but even more importantly than that, it's us in relationship and mutual care that most accurately reflects God as Trinity. Yeah. David, we're going to bring the mic around. Thank you, Siri.
And again, if you're going to get to this later, shut me down. But I'm still kind of confused by the distinction between hope and faith, because hope doesn't seem nearly as strong as faith to me. And like back to the Nazi discussion, the Nazi party had hope. I don't think they had faith.
Yeah,
And
no.
I'm trying to figure out the distinction. What distinction he made between.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that for Moltmann in particular, hope has to be rooted in this faith in order for it to be the sort of muscular hope that he understands Christian hope to be, rather than the sort of hope that is based on, and a hope that is, that is mindful of and cares for the world rather than simply the self, right? When you talk about the Nazis being hopeful, I think that's more self-determination, right? Hope of my own will to power, which is different than a faith-based hope that is understands me as part of this community of relationship. Yes.
Okay. I don't want to like hijack the conversation. Is your name Carl? Carl? I think what he's describing is free will. At least that's what I'm hearing. And that goes back to what I was saying before about why it's admirable that this gentleman chose to leave, right?
Mm-hmm.
So free will, in my opinion, answers the why. Why do bad things happen,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if we didn't have free will, then we wouldn't really be making a choice to have faith or have a choice to have hope. It would just be placed on us. So this idea of free will is what creates good, but unfortunately, it also gives people the option to do bad.
Tommy, that's exactly Moltmann's position. That in a different book, that is exactly what he
Okay,
says.
well, I promise I have not read him. But to string the two together, I mean, why were there Nazis? Why are there bad people today? Everyone has a choice. And if we didn't have a choice, then we would all just be robots.
Exactly. And actually, and for Moltmann, the fact that we have that free will that you're talking about, that God makes room for something other than God to exist, is what accounts for the free will in Moltmann's theology, right? That is what makes the relationship between us and God real and not a puppet master marionette relationship. And it also demonstrates God's willingness to be in real and vulnerable and loving relationship with creation. I want this relationship to be a real one, not just in name only. And so, yes, there is this sort of making allowance that, free will is going to mean that we do treat each other badly, right? That there is evil and suffering in the world. But for, at least in Moltmann's cosmology, that is because God loves us enough and wants our fullness of life enough to give us those choices so that the relationship can be a genuine relationship with God. Anything on this before we go? Okay. In the book, I want to run through these just rather quickly. Moltmann talks about three main challenges to hope for us in the 21st century. The first one, violence, war, terror, the nuclear threat. The second one being the looming and current crisis of climate change. And the third one being social and economic inequality. He says that these three 21st century challenges to hope together can contribute to a profound moment, cultural moment of despair. And we talked a little bit at the top of the hour about some of those things, right? Some of the things that are keeping us up at night, that are challenges to our own hope. And that can be a threat to us personally, but also can pose an existential threat, because when we lose hope and we stop engaging in the ways that Margaret has lifted up for us, stop doing what we can in our little corner of the world, and that can pose a bigger threat than just to ourselves, right? But Moltmann reminds us that the Christian faith has always had so much to say in answer to despair, that we dwell in and trust in God's eternal yes, which is what I was talking about earlier, right? That death doesn't have the last word, that the crucifixion and the resurrection means that suffering isn't the end of the story. And so in that belief, when we can dwell in that trust, we are affirming the goodness of humanity, the fragile, the fragileness, but also the worth savingness of the world. So God's love then empowers us to love life and to resist the culture of death that we see around us. Anything before I move on? So what is the hope that our faith offers in response? So the first slide was about violence, terror, death, war. What's the content of our faith? What does our faith have to say to us about violence? Where's the hope in response to that? One thing, I think, is that we follow a Messiah who suffered a violent death and yet is raised to new life, to eternal life, right? So in that belief, we live in that promise that death doesn't have the last word. And when we act against and refuse to participate in the violence, in the death-dealing systems of the world, in the systems that normalize violence, we are living out that piece of our faith, and we are extending hope to the world. Sarah, you look like you want to say something.
You're doing everything right. I was thinking about all the ways that this could be understood,
Mm-hmm.
which is things can happen across the world and we can just go, well, it won't always be like this.
Mm-hmm.
But that omission of not trying to interrupt that process and just sitting back and going, it won't always be like this, that is not participating in hope.
Right.
That's just alleviating our own sadness that it's happening, but it's not actually contributing to a change for the people who are actually suffering.
Right, absolutely. And for Moltmann, again, the image of God means that we are in community and in loving relationship with one another. And so that's the call and the responsibility, right? That we don't just say, well, in the by and by, it'll all be better, right? But that we are responsible to one another, and that's how we live out our role as image bearers of God, is by being God's hand and feet to a often hopeless world. Yeah. David has a question.
All right. The wasn't that some of the early resistance to Jesus's message, that he didn't feel like he was here to alleviate their physical suffering and the violence against, from the Romans and such like that? Like weren't a lot of people like, what are you going to do for us against, how are you going to help us rise up against the Romans? And he said, well, that's not why I'm here, kind of thing. Wasn't that kind of some of the resistance towards Jesus, that he wasn't like, he felt like he wasn't there to alleviate the violent suffering.
That's not for me a particularly strong thread. I mean, I think that I can see where you're pointing to that, but I guess I don't know how to speak to it. Yeah, because in my view, you see Jesus actively resisting the Roman powers, just not in the ways that were expected, right? They put him to death ultimately, the Roman state, and violently. And so for Jesus, the only option in the face of that violence was not to participate in the violent system in the way that they would have expected, right? To submit to it in order to show the world something different, show the world God's peaceful alternative. And so for me, that's how Jesus interacted with those powers. And I see a sort of dissatisfied expression, and I think that you're giving voice to what was often probably a dissatisfaction with a response that doesn't feel like it's doing enough, right? Certainly. But I think that what Jesus wanted to redirect us to was a totally different paradigm, right? That we can only enter by living as if, right? By living into it. Barbara.
Well, Jesus' response to Roman oppression was, if a Roman soldier who's walking along demands that you walk with him a mile carrying his pack, walk with him another mile.
Right.
That will drive him nuts.
Right.
And if someone demands your clothes, take off all your clothes and shame him for making you do that.
Right.
So he had responses, but they weren't military responses.
Exactly. Exactly. And then thinking about in response to the climate crisis, where we find hope in our faith. Understanding creation itself as imperfect, as unfinished, as still unfolding, in affirming that God is still at work, present in creation and at work in creation, that it is and that we are called to steward it, right? That there is still work to be done, that we aren't done yet, is one place I think we can find hope in terms of looking at the climate crisis. Any questions or additions on this one? And then in response to social and economic inequality, that should say inequality, we belong to a God of compassion and mercy, and we follow a Savior who first sought out the poor and the oppressed and those afflicted in order to heal them of those afflictions. And so we can find God's hope in following that example. We become God's hope, the world's hope, and our own hope when we love actively, when we work for justice, when we practice mercy. For Moltmann, God is always personal. And it's interesting because Moltmann is regarded sometimes not only as the theology of hope, but as a political theologian. And Moltmann would say that theology is always political because it is always personal, and it always is rooted in our actual lives in the world. And if it isn't, then we're doing something else. It's a different God, right? Because the God that we know, the God that we meet in the life and ministry of Jesus, the God that Moltmann met in the New Testament and in the Psalms in that POW camp, was a God who was a personal God who was active in the world. Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, exactly. For Moltmann, this sense of mysticism of the lived life, I love this idea, is that our hope, our faith is given shape when we fall in love with life in the world, because that's where God is found. Here and now, God with us in the world. That's what Jesus means to us ultimately, right? That God is here. And so, So when we talk about mysticism, what we're really talking about is transcending transcending a binary, or transcending, the world as it appears, in order to understand a third element. Like in the simplest terms of mysticism, we're talking about transcendence, in order to see things from a different perspective. And so when he talks about the mysticism of the lived life, he means seeing that, contrary to the appearances, that there are good and bad, and the world is, full of suffering and bad things. Yes, it is, but also it is full of God. And when we are alive in ourselves and our bodies, in our lives, and with one another, we're also absorbing the God-soakedness of everything, right? We are in relationship with God. And so he says, our bodily senses link us to the world. We don't have to use them only in order to live and to work. We have to also cultivate them in terms of developing a reverence for life, falling in love with, cultivate our senses in order to fall in love with life, so that we can appreciate, see, and experience the presence of the living God here in our lives. And that's ultimately what gives us hope and animates us and sends us out. He says, God breathes through the whole creation. We are seized by his spirit of life. Then an undreamt of love for life awakens in us, and our senses are aroused. This new mysticism of life breaks through our inner paralysis so that we can both maintain hope and be the hope that the world needs.
Sarah, is he critiquing a different understanding of mysticism?
I don't take him to be critiquing, but perhaps expanding.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Anything to ask or to add here?
Hi, this is Becky from
Becky.
the Zoom. Can I just throw in something, Sarah?
Please.
So I just want to say thank you so much, and everyone's comments have really contributed. So this is just my takeaway. Is I feel a lack of hope when I feel powerless. So all of the different scenarios and difficulties that we've talked about all seem bigger than anything I can do anything about. And so for me, in terms of, and you were just sort of getting back to this in terms of the personal and sensory experience and our lived experience, I ground myself in my own places where I find joy. And I feel more powerful when I'm connected to this church, to this community, and to bigger things than me that I see are powerful in making change. So a lot like what Margaret was saying, like so this isn't the right way I mean it, but not that I take credit for, but I own the fact that I'm part of a community that's doing such active, meaningful, impactful work to alleviate the suffering of others, even though I myself can't do it and I don't do it. So I just keep going back and forth with this hope and this distinction between hope and faith, because hope to me is more a feeling, and faith is almost like no matter what, whether you believe. But I just really wanted to thank everyone for this conversation, because it sort of reminds me of where I can find hope and even look for it, right?
Becky, that's beautiful. And I heard you sort of bring together a lot of different threads of our conversation. And when you were talking about, finding joy, right, in order to sort of replenish hope, I think that's exactly what Moltmann is talking about when he talks about the mysticism of the lived life, right? To find the joy of being alive and the giftedness of being alive is one of the most hope-giving things that we can do. And then Becky, I also heard you sort of touch on Carl's point about, the overwhelm of feeling too small to make a dent in so many things. And so, the importance then of finding those places that we can do something, right? And identifying what is ours to do. And then I also hear you talking about the hope that we find in connection and in relationship and in community with one another, especially in a faith community where we are giving each other sort of inspiration and shoring up one another's hope by seeing, I see what you're doing and I see what you're doing and I see what you are doing. And that gives me hope to find what is mine to do. So thank you for that comment. In closing, Moltmann says, hope is lived when it comes alive, when we go outside of ourselves and in joy and pain, take part in the lives of others. So for Moltmann, it really is all about this sort of sense of being grasped by a personal and present God, and letting that hold us, transform us, and send us out to share it with other people. Any last words, questions, or remarks before we go this morning? Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for being here.